Welcome to a journey into one of the most unsettling cases in American history. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Is anyone near the ancient forests of Missouri? Because the story we are about to share occurred right there, where the trees guard secrets too terrifying to speak aloud. In 1894, a heavy autumn settled over the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri. The leaves turned bronze and crimson, covering the trails that snaked through deep valleys and mist-shrouded cliffs. Travel through this region was difficult at that time. There were no paved roads, only dirt paths, disappearing among ancient pines and oaks. The towns were small and isolated, separated by miles of dense woodland. The nearest train was days away on foot, and anyone crossing this land relied on wagons, horses, and immense courage. Webster County was one of those places left behind by progress, with few families scattered on remote farms. Life revolved around timber, hunting, and small farms. News took weeks to arrive, brought by travelers or the occasional newspaper. The law was weak. The nearest sheriff was in Springfield, over 50 miles away, and he rarely ventured onto the remote trails. Here, every person was responsible for their own safety. It was in this environment that a strange rumor began to circulate. Travelers passing through the Ozarks told bizarre tales of sounds emanating from the forest depths, not animal noises, but rhythmic, constant drum beats echoing among the trees at night. Some claimed they resembled ancient indigenous songs from tribes long gone from the land, while others insisted it was something else, something not of this world. Initially, people laughed it off, attributing the stories to tired imaginations, the wind beating against hollow logs, or the effects of cheap whiskey from roadside taverns. But as weeks passed, more reports surfaced, all describing the same thing: drums in the forest, always near a deep valley the locals had avoided since the first settlers. This valley had a name few dared to speak. The elders called it the Hollow of Bones, though no one knew the name's true origin. They said something was wrong with that place, that the ground was cursed, and animals avoided it. Some spoke of hunting expeditions that had vanished decades earlier, but these were just legends, campfire stories to frighten children, or so everyone wanted to believe. In mid-October of that year, a group of 6 travelers arrived in the small village of Marshfield in Webster County. They came from the east, from larger cities like St. Louis and Jefferson City, seeking cheap land to start anew. The group consisted of 4 men and 2 women, all aged between 20 and 40, with 2 wagons loaded with supplies, tools, and enough provisions for several weeks. They planned to cross the Ozarks into Arkansas, where they had heard of fertile land for sale. They stopped at Marshfield's only tavern to rest and ask for the best route. The owner, a man named Josiah Thorne, aged 52, served them venison stew and cornbread while sketching a crude map on paper. He showed them the main trail along the riverbank, a 3-day journey to the border. But when one traveler asked about a shortcut, Josiah fell silent, staring at his whiskey glass before sighing. He admitted there was a shorter path through the mountains, saving nearly a day, but he strongly advised against it. The trail passed near the Hollow of Bones, and there were the drums. The travelers laughed. A tall man with a red beard declared he wasn't afraid of ghost stories. Another argued that speed was essential with the changing weather and approaching winter rains. Josiah tried to insist, but it was useless. These people had the naive confidence of those who had never faced the Ozarks' dangers. Early the next morning, the group departed. Josiah watched from his porch as the wagons vanished into the trees. He would never see them alive again. The first 2 days were peaceful, according to later accounts. The trail followed a narrow ridge above misty valleys, the weather cold but dry. At night, they camped in clearings, built large fires, and discussed their future plans. Everything seemed normal and safe until the third night. They had camped near a stream where the trail descended into the valley. The sun set quickly, plunging the forest into darkness within minutes. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows, and then they heard the drums, a low, distant heartbeat from the forest depths. One man raised his hand for silence. Everyone stopped talking. Only the fire's crackle and the relentless rhythmic beats remained, a repetitive pulse, like something huge breathing in the woods. One woman urged them to leave immediately, to douse the fire and retreat even in the dark. But others hesitated. The night was treacherous, and moving the heavy wagons without light risked accidents. One man argued it was just sound, perhaps native rituals or distant storms. Nothing to panic over. Then the sound changed. The beats grew faster, more intense, seeming to approach from all directions, surrounding the camp. And now there was something else, something that chilled their blood. Voices. They weren't recognizable words or screams, but deep, overlapping murmurs, as if dozens of mouths spoke at once in an inhuman language. The red-bearded man grabbed his rifle. Another lit a torch and stepped to the clearing's edge. But the darkness was absolute, the torchlight penetrating only a few meters. The drums became nearly deafening, vibrating in their chests, making the ground tremble. Then they saw the first figures-tall silhouette standing motionless among the trees like statues. They didn't move or make a sound beyond that low chant. They just watched. The man with the torch shouted, demanding identification, but there was no response. One woman began praying aloud. Another cried silently, clinging to a man's arm. The group huddled around the fire, rifles aimed into the darkness, waiting for something they couldn't name. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The drums and voices ceased. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. The figures were gone, or perhaps never there, leaving only the cold night and the wind. No one slept. They kept the fire burning until dawn, watching every shadow. When the sun rose, pale through the fog, they could hardly believe they had survived. But something had changed. Something in the air, in the way the forest watched them. They should have turned back, abandoned the wagons and fled to Marshfield. But pride, fear of cowardice, or sheer human stubbornness pushed them onward. They were near the other side of the mountains. 1 or 2 more days, and they would be safe. They descended into the valley, the trail narrowing and steepening, winding between moss-covered rocks and twisted roots, like claws. Sunlight barely pierced the dense canopy. It was like entering a green, damp tunnel. At noon, they found the first mark, a symbol carved into a huge oak tree by the trail. It wasn't any known alphabet, a jagged spiral surrounded by root-like lines. The wood around it was dark, stained with what might be sap or old blood. They found more marks, always the same symbol, as if guiding or warning them. One man suggested they were old hunters' marks, but something felt inhuman about the carving's depth and appearance. By afternoon, they reached the heart of the Hollow of Bones. The valley opened before them, a deep depression between steep slopes covered in thick, persistent mist. Dead, black trees stood in the center, their trunks twisted and leafless. The ground was a thick layer of rotting leaves, emitting a sweet, foul odor, and bones were everywhere. Deer, bears, unidentifiable animals, scattered among the trees and half buried in mud. In the center, partially overgrown, was a structure. Stones piled into an irregular circle about 10 meters across. Inside, the ground was hard-packed earth, devoid of vegetation. The travelers halted at the valley's edge, unwilling to descend, but the trail led straight through the stone circle. Going around would add days, and supplies were low. The red-bearded man decided they would descend quickly, cross the circle, and climb the opposite slope before nightfall. No stopping, no camping. They began the descent. The wagon wheels sank into soft earth, the horses reluctant. The fog was denser than it seemed, limiting visibility to a few meters. The silence was absolute, no birds, insects, or animals, only the creaking wheels and horses breathing. By the time they reached the stone circle, the sun was low, casting distorted shadows through the mist. One man suggested camping inside the circle for the firm ground, but others refused. The place felt deeply wrong, making their skin crawl. Then the drums started again, this time from below, as if something huge was striking underground, vibrating the ground. The stones in the circle trembled, emitting a high-pitched tinkle. The horses panicked, neighing and pulling at their reins. One wagon almost tipped, and the figures reappeared, now closer, forming a circle around them. They were tall, humanoid, but wrong, some bent unnaturally, others too rigid. They didn't move, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The red-bearded man fired his rifle into the air. The shot echoed, and for a moment, the drums stopped. The silence was worse, a pressing emptiness. Then the figures began to move, sliding without walking, flowing through the mist like ink. As they neared, the travelers saw details that could shatter sanity. They weren't human. Their proportions were off, limbs too long, faces dark blurs. They seemed vegetative, made of intertwined roots and bark, covered in translucent skin. Some had branches protruding from shoulders, others dripped dark sap. One woman fainted. A man lifted her, shouting to flee. There was no more debate. They had to escape. They whipped the horses mercilessly. The wagons shook over the stones, racing for the opposite slope. But the creatures gave chase, gliding faster, closer. The drums resumed, louder and frenetic, with those overlapping, dead-tongued voices that chilled the blood. One creature reached the rear wagon, touching it with something like an arm. The wagon shook as if struck by lightning, the wood rotting before their eyes, darkening, cracking, disintegrating into ash. The driver leaped out, abandoning everything, running after the other wagon already climbing the slope. They didn't look back. Stopping meant being caught. Welcome to a journey into one of the most unsettling cases in American history. Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Is anyone near the ancient forests of Missouri? Because the story we are about to share occurred right there, where the trees guard secrets too terrifying to speak aloud. In 1894, a heavy autumn settled over the Ozark Mountains in southern Missouri. The leaves turned bronze and crimson, covering the trails that snaked through deep valleys and mist-shrouded cliffs. Travel through this region was difficult at that time. There were no paved roads, only dirt paths disappearing among ancient pines and oaks. The towns were small and isolated, separated by miles of dense woodland. The nearest train was days away on foot, and anyone crossing this land relied on wagons, horses, and immense courage. Webster County was one of those places left behind by progress, with few families scattered on remote farms. Life revolved around timber, hunting, and small farms. News took weeks to arrive, brought by travelers or the occasional newspaper. The law was weak. The nearest sheriff was in Springfield, over 50 miles away, and he rarely ventured onto the remote trails. Here, every person was responsible for their own safety. It was in this environment that a strange rumor began to circulate. Travelers passing through the Ozarks told bizarre tales of sounds emanating from the forest. Depths, not animal noises, but rhythmic, constant drumbeats, echoing among the trees at night. Some claimed they resembled ancient indigenous songs from tribes long gone from the land, while others insisted it was something else, something not of this world. Initially, people laughed it off, attributing the stories to tired imaginations, the wind beating against hollow logs, or the effects of cheap whiskey from roadside taverns. But as weeks passed, more reports surfaced, all describing the same thing. Drums in the forest, always near a deep valley the locals had avoided since the first settlers. This valley had a name few dared to speak. The elders called it the Hollow of Bones, though no one knew the name's true origin. They said something was wrong with that place, that the ground was cursed and animals avoided it. Some spoke of hunting expeditions that had vanished decades earlier, but these were just legends, campfire stories to frighten children, or so everyone wanted to believe. In mid-October of that year, a group of 6 travelers arrived in the small village of Marshfield in Webster County. They came from the east, from larger cities like St. Louis and Jefferson City, seeking cheap land to start anew. The group consisted of 4 men and 2 women, all aged between 20 and 40, with 2 wagons loaded with supplies, tools, and enough provisions for several weeks. They planned to cross the Ozarks into Arkansas, where they had heard of fertile land for sale. They stopped at Marshfield's only tavern to rest and ask for the best route. The owner, a man named Josiah Thorne, aged 52, served them venison stew and cornbread while sketching a crude map on paper. He showed them the main trail along the riverbank, a 3-day journey to the border. But when one traveler asked about a shortcut, Josiah fell silent, staring at his whiskey glass before sighing. He admitted there was a shorter path through the mountains, saving nearly a day, but he strongly advised against it. The trail passed near the Hollow of Bones, and there were the drums. The travelers laughed. A tall man with a red beard declared he wasn't afraid of ghost stories. Another argued that speed was essential with the changing weather and approaching winter rains. Josiah tried to insist, but it was useless. These people had the naive confidence of those who had never faced the Ozarks' dangers. Early the next morning, the group departed. Josiah watched from his porch as the wagons vanished into the trees. He would never see them alive again. The first 2 days were peaceful, according to later accounts. The trail followed a narrow ridge above misty valleys, the weather cold but dry. At night, they camped in clearings, built large fires, and discussed their future plans. Everything seemed normal and safe until the 3rd night. They had camped near a stream where the trail descended into the valley. The sun set quickly, plunging the forest into darkness within minutes. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows, and then they heard the drums, a low, distant heartbeat from the forest depths. One man raised his hand for silence. Everyone stopped talking. Only the fire's crackle and the relentless, rhythmic beats remained, a repetitive pulse, like something huge breathing in the woods. One woman urged them to leave immediately, to douse the fire and retreat even in the dark. But others hesitated. The night was treacherous, and moving the heavy wagons without light risked accidents. One man argued it was just sound, perhaps native rituals or distant storms, nothing to panic over. Then the sound changed. The beats grew faster, more intense, seeming to approach from all directions, surrounding the camp. And now there was something else, something that chilled their blood. Voices. They weren't recognizable words or screams, but deep, overlapping murmurs, as if dozens of mouths spoke at once in an inhuman language. The red-bearded man grabbed his rifle. Another lit a torch and stepped to the clearing's edge, but the darkness was absolute, the torchlight penetrating only a few meters. The drums became nearly deafening, vibrating in their chests, making the ground tremble. Then they saw the first figures-tall silhouettes, standing motionless among the trees, like statues. They didn't move or make a sound beyond that low chant. They just watched. The man with the torch shouted, demanding identification, but there was no response. One woman began praying aloud. Another cried silently, clinging to a man's arm. The group huddled around the fire, rifles aimed into the darkness, waiting for something they couldn't name. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The drums and voices ceased. Silence fell like a heavy blanket. The figures were gone, or perhaps never there, leaving only the cold night and the wind. No one slept. They kept the fire burning until dawn, watching every shadow. When the sun rose, pale through the fog, they could hardly believe they had survived. But something had changed. Something in the air, in the way the forest watched them. They should have turned back, abandoned the wagons, and fled to Marshfield. But pride, fear of cowardice, or sheer human stubbornness pushed them onward. They were near the other side of the mountains. 1 or 2 more days, and they would be safe. They descended into the valley, the trail narrowing and steepening, winding between moss-covered rocks and twisted roots like claws. Sunlight barely pierced the dense canopy. It was like entering a green, damp tunnel. At noon, they found the first mark, a symbol carved into a huge oak tree by the trail. It wasn't any known alphabet, a jagged spiral surrounded by root-like lines. The wood around it was dark, stained with what might be sap or old blood. They found more marks, always the same symbol, as if guiding or warning them. One man suggested they were old hunters' marks, but something felt inhuman about the carving's depth and appearance. By afternoon, they reached the heart of the Hollow of Bones. The valley opened before them, a deep depression between steep slopes covered in thick, persistent mist. Dead, black trees stood in the center, their trunks twisted and leafless. The ground was a thick layer of rotting leaves, emitting a sweet, foul odor, and bones were everywhere. Deer, bears, unidentifiable animals, scattered among the trees and half buried in mud. In the center, partially overgrown, was a structure. Stones piled into an irregular circle about 10 meters across. Inside, the ground was hard-packed earth, devoid of vegetation. The travelers halted at the valley's edge, unwilling to descend, but the trail led straight through the stone circle. Going around would add days, and supplies were low. The red-bearded man decided they would descend quickly, cross the circle, and climb the opposite slope before nightfall. No stopping, no camping. They began the descent. The wagon wheels sank into soft earth, the horses reluctant. The fog was denser than it seemed, limiting visibility to a few meters. The silence was absolute. No birds, insects, or animals, only the creaking wheels and horses breathing. By the time they reached the stone circle, the sun was low, casting distorted shadows through the mist. One man suggested camping inside the circle for the firm ground, but others refused. The place felt deeply wrong, making their skin crawl. Then the drums started again, this time from below, as if something huge was striking underground, vibrating the ground. The stones in the circle trembled, emitting a high-pitched tinkle. The horses panicked, neighing and pulling at their reins. One wagon almost tipped, and the figures reappeared, now closer, forming a circle around them. They were tall, humanoid, but wrong, some bent unnaturally, others too rigid. They didn't move, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The red-bearded man fired his rifle into the air. The shot echoed, and for a moment, the drum stopped. The silence was worse, a pressing emptiness. Then the figures began to move, sliding without walking, flowing through the mist like ink. As they neared, the travelers saw details that could shatter sanity. They weren't human. Their proportions were off, limbs too long, faces dark blurs. They seemed vegetative, made of intertwined roots and bark, covered in translucent skin. Some had branches protruding from shoulders. others dripped dark sap. One woman fainted. A man lifted her, shouting to flee. There was no more debate. They had to escape. They whipped the horses mercilessly. The wagons shook over the stones, racing for the opposite slope. But the creatures gave chase, gliding faster, closer. The drums resumed, louder and frenetic, with those overlapping, dead-tongued voices that chilled the blood. One creature reached the rear wagon, touching it with something like an arm. The wagon shook as if struck by lightning, the wood rotting before their eyes, darkening, cracking, disintegrating into ash. The driver leaped out, abandoning everything, running after the other wagon already climbing the slope. They didn't look back. Stopping meant being caught. They scrambled up the slope, abandoning half their supplies, tools, and clothing, anything that slowed their flight. The only thing that mattered was escape, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and that accursed valley. By the time they reached the top, the sun had fully set, plunging everything into total darkness. Yet they pressed on, guided only by the faint outline of the narrow path. The drums still echoed behind them, distant but persistent, as if the entire forest had transformed into a malevolent instrument. No one knows how long they walked that night hours, certainly, perhaps the entire night. When they finally stopped, the drums had fallen silent. They found themselves in a different clearing, far from the valley, in a part of the woods that seemed normal, almost welcoming by comparison. They collapsed to the ground, too exhausted to light a fire, too exhausted to think. At sunrise, they realized there were only 5 of them now. One of the men was gone. No one could recall when they had last seen him. In the chaos of the escape and the darkness, he had simply vanished. They called his name and searched the clearing's edge, but found no trace. No one had the courage to retrace their steps. They decided to press forward, now faster, desperate to escape those mountains. The remaining wagon was damaged. A wheel cracked, but it was still movable. They followed the trail all day without rest or conversation, just placing one foot in front of the other, hoping each turn would reveal signs of civilization. But the forest seemed endless, the trees closing in like living walls, their intertwined branches blocking the sun, and a lingering sense of being followed was a constant, oppressive presence. They saw and heard nothing but their own movement, yet the feeling remained. In the late afternoon, they found the second victim, or what was left of him. One man had stepped away briefly to fetch water from a stream and returned screaming, his face as white as paper. He had found clothes belonging to the missing man, torn, stained, and scattered among the roots of a fallen tree. There was no body, just the clothes and something else. Marks on the surrounding tree bark, those same jagged spirals they had seen before, only now they were fresh, with sap still oozing out. No one touched the clothes. They returned to the trail in silence and continued walking. There were no more tears, no conventional fear left, just a cold numbness and a terrible acceptance that they might not leave that place alive. Night fell again, forcing them to stop. They couldn't navigate the treacherous trails in the dark. They lit a small fire, huddled around it with loaded rifles on their knees. The 2 women were in shock, staring into the void. The 2 remaining men took turns on watch, though both knew that if those creatures returned, there would be no defense. The drums did not come that night, but something worse happened. One of the women, the one who had fainted in the valley, began talking to herself, muttering incomprehensible words in the same dead language they had heard in the creature's chant. Her eyes were open but unseeing, fixed on somewhere beyond the fire, the trees, the world of the living. The red-bearded man tried to wake her, shaking her shoulders and calling her name repeatedly, but she didn't respond. She kept muttering those strange words, faster and louder, until her voice became a high-pitched shriek, echoing through the forest. Then, abruptly, she stopped. She fell forward, unconscious, her breathing irregular. They laid her by the fire, covering her with their few remaining blankets. Her skin was cold to the touch despite the flames, her pulse weak and erratic. The other woman tried to care for her, wetting her forehead with water from a canteen, whispering hollow words of comfort. No one slept. They watched the surrounding forest, waiting for the silhouettes to reappear among the trees. But the night remained quiet, save for the cold wind through the bare branches and the fire's crackle in unnatural stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, watching and waiting. When dawn came, faint and gray through the morning mist, the woman who had screamed did not wake up. Her breathing had ceased some time before sunrise, silently, without a struggle. Her body was rigid, her eyes still open, fixed on the invisible sky above the treetops. There were no visible marks, no signs of violence, as if her soul had been simply ripped out during the night. They had no tools for a proper grave. They covered the body with leaves and branches, said a hurried prayer, and moved on. Now there were 4 broken, traumatized people staggering through a seemingly endless forest. The trail began to climb again, winding up a rocky slope with sparse trees. It was a relief to emerge from the deep shade, to feel the weak sun on their skin, to see the horizon opening up. From that elevation, they could see other mountains in the distance, shrouded in the Ozark's perpetual mist. Somewhere beyond those peaks was Arkansas, civilization, safety. But there was still so far to go. And then the wagon finally gave way. The cracked wheel broke completely over a large rock, and the vehicle tipped over with a crash, scattering their few remaining supplies. The horses, finally free of the load, bolted down the trail before anyone could stop them. Now they were truly alone. No transport, no animals, only what they could carry on their backs. The red-bearded man distributed what they could take: some dry food, water canteens, blankets, ammunition for the rifles. They abandoned everything else, including the dreams of a new life that had brought them to this green hell. They continued on foot. The walk was slow and painful. Their bodies were weak from lack of food and sleep, their boots worn, their feet blistered. But they couldn't stop. To stop meant to die. That was clear now. The forest did not forgive weakness. By late afternoon, they reached a place that looked familiar. A stream, a clearing, a specific arrangement of moss-covered rocks. The other man, the one without a beard, stopped abruptly and said they had been there before, yesterday, or maybe the day before. They were going in circles. The red-bearded man denied it. It was impossible. They had followed the trail forward, never back. But the more they looked, the more familiar it seemed. And then they saw it. Carved into a nearby tree, half hidden by a creeper, was one of those symbols, the irregular spiral surrounded by finger-like lines. It wasn't old. The exposed wood was still fresh, the cut recent. Someone or something was marking their path, guiding them, keeping them inside the forest. This realization fell on the group like ice water. They had never been in control. From the moment they entered the Hollow of Bones, perhaps even before, from the first night they heard the drums, they had been herded like animals toward some incomprehensible destination. The other woman, who had remained strong until then, finally collapsed. She fell to her knees in the mud and began to cry, deep sobs shaking her whole body. She begged them to stop, to give up, to just lie down and wait for the end. There was no hope, no way out. The forest had captured them and would never let them go. The red-bearded man lifted her firmly, almost brutally. He said they would not die there, that they would fight until their last breath. But his voice trembled, his eyes reflecting the same despair everyone felt. Still, they moved. They chose a different direction, ignoring the marked trail, cutting straight through the dense forest, hoping that by breaking the pattern, they could escape the invisible labyrinth trapping them. The vegetation was thick, scratching their faces and tearing their clothes. Thorns embedded in their flesh, treacherous roots made them stumble with every step. But they kept going, advancing blindly through the primordial woods, away from the trail, from logic, from any sense of direction. That's when the fog descended again. They knew immediately it wasn't natural. It was too thick, too white, and carried that sweet smell of decay from the valley. It enveloped everything within minutes, reducing visibility to less than a meter. They clung to each other to avoid separation, moving slowly, groping their way through the invisible trees. And then they heard footsteps. Not the sliding steps of the creatures, but normal human footsteps on the forest floor, coming from within the mist. A voice called out. It was the voice of the man they had lost the first night, the one who had disappeared during the escape from the valley. The red-bearded man shouted back, calling his lost companion's name. The voice answered, closer now, saying he was injured, that he needed help, that he could see a way out of the forest just ahead. He urged them to follow him, to come quickly. Something in the tone was wrong. The other woman noticed first. She grabbed the red-bearded man's arm, whispering urgently that they should not follow that voice, that it wasn't really their companion, that it was a trap. But the other man had already started walking toward the voice, calling out that he was coming. The red-bearded man tried to hold him back, but he pulled away sharply and plunged into the thick mist, vanishing within seconds. They heard his footsteps growing fainter, then a pause, a brief and terrible silence, and then a scream. It wasn't a scream of physical pain. It was worse. The sound of someone witnessing something no human mind should ever see, something that shattered sanity into irreparable pieces. The scream cut through the air for long seconds, then turned into hysterical laughter mixed with sobs, and then total silence. No more footsteps, no breathing, nothing. Just the impenetrable white mist enveloping everything. The red-bearded man and the woman were paralyzed, clinging to each other, barely daring to breathe. They waited for minutes that felt like hours. The mist did not lift. The silence was absolute. Finally, he whispered that they had to move, that staying still meant death. She nodded silently. They began to walk again, this time with extreme care, testing each step before putting their weight down, moving like ghosts through that dead white world. They had no direction, no plan. They just moved away from where they had heard the scream, hoping distance would bring an escape. The mist began to dissipate gradually, first revealing the dark shapes of trees, then the leaf-covered ground, then the gray sky through the canopy. They were in a different part of the forest now, where the trees were even older, their trunks grotesquely thick, twisted into shapes that defied nature. Some had dark holes, like open mouths. Others had roots, rising from the ground, like frozen tentacles. And there were more symbols, not just on tree trunks, but on stones, on the ground, even on fallen leaves. It was as if someone or something had recently passed through, marking everything, reclaiming the entire territory, transforming it into something no longer belonging to the natural world. They moved through those monstrous trees, their nerves stretched to the limit, every shadow seeming to move, every sound making them jump. The afternoon was advancing rapidly, and soon it would be night again, the third night in that hell. They knew they wouldn't survive another night in the open, without fire or proper shelter. That's when they found the hut. It appeared among the trees like a mirage, a small wooden structure covered in moss and vines, almost swallowed by the forest. The door was half open, creaking slightly in the wind. There were no signs of life, no smoke from the chimney, but it was shelter, a place to hide from the approaching night. The red-bearded man approached slowly, rifle in hand, pushing the door open with his foot, The hinge groaned, revealing a dark interior. Weak light filtered through holes in the roof and cracks in the walls. The floor was covered in leaves and debris. There was rudimentary furniture, a table slumped on its side, a broken chair, empty shelves on the wall. And there were bones, lots of bones, stacked in a corner, clean and whitish, undoubtedly human. Skulls, ribs, femurs, all carefully arranged in a macabre pile. Next to the pile, carved large enough for a person to lie within, was that cursed symbol on the wooden floor. The woman recoiled, covering her mouth to stifle a scream. The red-bearded man entered anyway, checking every corner, every shadow. There was nothing else. The cabin had been abandoned for a long time, decades perhaps. Whoever had lived there, whoever had left those bones, was gone. But it was shelter, and night was falling. They had no choice. They dragged the bones out using branches to avoid touching them directly, and threw them into the forest. They covered the symbol on the floor with leaves and dirt. They closed the door as best they could, and lit a small fire in the hut's center, using dry wood piled in a corner. They sat by the flames, sharing the last piece of dried meat, drinking from near-empty canteens. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. They just stared into the fire, lost in thoughts too heavy to voice. Night fell completely, the darkness absolute beyond the cracks in the walls. And then, inevitably, the drums began, distant at first, but gradually approaching. And this time, they were accompanied by footsteps, many footsteps, circling the cabin, slowly and methodically. The red-bearded man loaded his rifle, positioning himself by the door. The woman grabbed a knife from her belt, her hand shaking so much the blade reflected the firelight in chaotic patterns. They waited, listening to the footsteps go round and round and round. Hours passed like this. The fire was dwindling, but neither of them dared to move to add more wood. Then a voice spoke from outside. It was not the voice of their lost companion, nor any voice they had ever heard. It was multiple voices overlapping, as if dozens of people were speaking in unison, yet all uttering the same words in clear, understandable English. It stated that they had been chosen, that the forest had called them, that the drums had guided them, and that they now belonged to that place. It said their bodies would nourish the earth, their bones would join the others, and their voices would add to the eternal choir. It insisted that resistance was futile, that acceptance was peace, and that the end was merely a beginning. The red-bearded man shouted back, vowing they would never surrender and would fight to their last breath. He fired his rifle through a crack in the wall, the shot deafening in the confined space. The voice laughed, a sound not human, but like branches snapping, wind whistling through hollow bones, and earth crumbling over forgotten graves. The footsteps ceased. The drums fell silent, and then something began to push against the door. Slowly, with inexorable force, the old wood groaned under the pressure. The red-bearded man threw his weight against the door, trying to hold it shut, but the strength on the other side was too great. The door began to splinter, inch by inch. The woman looked around desperately for another escape and saw a small window in the back wall, partially boarded up. She ran to it, tearing the planks away with strength, born of pure panic, and squeezed through the narrow opening. She fell to the damp ground outside, rolled, and began to run. She ran without looking back, without thinking, without any sense of direction, just away from the cabin, away from those supernatural voices, away from the death she felt breathing down her neck. The forest was a blur of shadows and branches that tore at her skin, but she felt no pain. Terror had anesthetized her, turning her into pure adrenaline and survival instinct. Behind her, She heard a loud crash as the cabin door finally gave way. She heard the red-bearded man scream, a cry of defiance that quickly morphed into something far more disturbing. And then silence. A silence worse than any sound, because it meant she was now completely alone. She tripped over a root and fell face first into the mud. For a moment, she lay there, breathing in desperate gulps, her heart pounding as if it would explode. Tears mixed with the mud on her face. She wanted to give up, to just close her eyes and let it end. But some stubborn part of her mind forced her to stand, to keep moving. She staggered to her feet and continued, now more slowly, trying to be silent. The moon had risen, faint and distant through the clouds, casting a ghostly light over the forest. It was enough to avoid the trees, but not enough to be sure nothing followed her in the shadows between the trunks. She walked for what felt like hours. The forest constantly shifted around her, never familiar, always revealing new terrors in every clearing, valley, and hillside. She passed trees dripping red sap, circles of mushrooms glowing faintly in the dark, and stones piled in unnatural formations. And always, at the edge of hearing, were the drums. They never fully stopped, pulsing like a distant heartbeat, reminding her the forest was alive, watching, and that no matter how far she ran, she could never truly escape. She came to a stream and followed its course, hoping the water would lead her out of the mountains. The current was swift, foaming over slippery rocks. She stumbled often, soaking herself in the icy water, but she kept going. The stream was real, natural, something that made sense in a world that had lost all logic. It was then that she saw the first light. It wasn't moonlight, but the flicker of firelight among the trees ahead. A thin, pale column of smoke rose into the air. For a moment, her heart filled with hope. Perhaps it was a farm, or travelers, real people who could help. She approached slowly, moving from tree to tree, trying to see without being seen. The light came from a fire in a small clearing. Around it were shapes. At first, she thought they were people sitting, but then she realized the terrible truth. They were the bodies of her companions. They were seated in a circle around the fire, positioned as if in friendly conversation, but they were dead. This was obvious, even from a distance. Their postures were too rigid, their angles wrong, their heads tilted in ways no living neck could support. And something was growing from them. Roots, branches sprouting from their mouths, their eyes, their open hands. They were being absorbed by the forest, transformed into a part of it. The red-bearded man was there, and the other two who had been lost, and even the woman who had died in her sleep, all gathered in a grotesque parody of companionship, slowly being devoured by the surrounding vegetation. She stepped back, her hand covering her mouth to stifle a scream of horror. She couldn't bear to look, yet she couldn't look away. And that's when she noticed an empty space in the circle. A prepared spot, with leaves arranged like a seat, branches set in a specific pattern, a place waiting for her. She turned and ran again, all attempts at silence abandoned. It no longer mattered if she made noise, if they heard her. They already knew where she was. They had always known, from the very beginning. The entire forest was an extension of those creatures. Every tree, an eye watching. Every root, a finger waiting to grab. She broke through the undergrowth, climbed steep slopes on her hands and knees, and descended into valleys where the mist swallowed her completely. Her lungs burned, her legs trembled with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. Stopping meant joining that circle, becoming another plant-like statue waiting for eternity in that cursed clearing. The forest began to change once more. The trees grew more widely spaced, the undergrowth less dense. More light penetrated the canopy, more sky was visible above. And then, miraculously, incredibly, she saw something she hadn't seen in days. A road. A real road, with wagon tracks, dirt beaten by wheels and hooves, leading away from the green nightmare. She staggered onto the road and fell to her knees in the middle of it, sobbing with relief. She had escaped. Against all odds, against the will of the forest itself, she had made it out. She looked back at the tree line from which she had emerged and saw them watching. They weren't just trees. They were sentinels, keepers of ancient secrets, silent witnesses to horrors repeated, generation after generation. But they did not follow her. They stood at the forest's edge, motionless, as if held by an invisible line they couldn't or wouldn't cross. The drums had stopped. The ensuing silence was of a different quality, no longer threatening, just empty and sad, as if the forest was mourning escaped prey. She got up, trembling, and began to follow the road. She didn't know where it led, and she didn't care. Anywhere was better than there. She walked for hours, stumbling occasionally, but always forward, always moving away. Dawn found her still walking. Sunlight had never looked so beautiful, so real, so alive. With the light came the normal sounds of the forest, birds chirping, squirrels scurrying in the branches, the wind rustling leaves without any hidden threat. And then she saw real smoke from real chimneys. Buildings appeared in the distance, a small village with wooden houses, a church with a white spire, real people moving between the buildings. Civilization, safety, life. She staggered into the village, barely able to believe it was real. The first people who saw her recoiled in fright. She must have looked like an apparition, clothes torn and muddy, hair matted with leaves and twigs, face scratched and stained with dried blood. Her eyes held the vacant stare of someone who had seen things that should not exist. An elderly man approached cautiously, asking if she needed help. She tried to speak, but no words came. Her throat was too dry, too bruised from screaming. She could only point back toward the distant line of the Ozark Mountains before she collapsed. She woke up in a clean bed in a small room that smelled of soap and medicinal herbs. An older woman was sitting beside her, holding her hand and applying cold compresses to her feverish forehead. It took days for her to speak coherently, for the fever to break, for her body to begin recovering from the physical trauma. But her mind would never fully heal. When she finally told her story, it came in pieces, disconnected fragments that the woman caring for her had to assemble like a macabre puzzle. She spoke of the drums, the non-human creatures, the valley of bones, the hut with its unholy altar, and the circle of the dead awaiting her arrival. The woman listened in silence, her face growing paler. When the survivor finished, the woman nodded slowly and said something that chilled her blood even in the safety of that sunlit room. She said she was not the first, that every few years, travelers disappeared in those mountains, that some returned broken and delirious, speaking of drums, voices, and things growing where they shouldn't, and that others never returned, leaving behind only abandoned wagons and scattered supplies on forgotten trails. The village she had reached was called Seymour, a small community at the southern end of Webster County. The residents knew the stories of the Ozarks, passed down through generations. They knew the places where the forest was strange, where animals would not go, where even the most experienced hunters got lost without explanation. Old records kept in the church's small library documented similar events dating back to the first settlers. In 1832, an entire family vanished. In 1857, a group of miners never returned from an expedition. In 1871, 2 brothers were found wandering, blind and mute, their minds shattered by something they could never describe. And the elements were always the same: the nightly drums, the trails that led in circles, the strange markings on the trees, the feeling of being herded like cattle toward a terrible fate. The forest was hungry, the elders said. It needed to feed, and it chose its victims by criteria no one understood. Seymour's sheriff, a 48-year-old man named William Hackett, organized a search expedition 2 weeks after her arrival. He gathered 12 armed men, all experienced in the mountains, and followed the vague directions she could provide. They searched for the hut, the Valley of Bones, the circle of the dead around the campfire. They found only silence. The trails she described were not where they should have been. The valley could not be located, though some men swore they knew every valley in the region. The hut with the bones simply did not exist, or at least could not be found. It was as if the very geography of the mountains had shifted, rearranging itself to hide its secrets. But they did find something. In a clearing deep in the forest, they discovered the remains of a wagon. It was old, the wood rotten and moss-covered, but the ironwork was still recognizable, and scattered around, half buried in the earth, were bones, many bones. More than 6 people could have left. Decades, perhaps centuries of victims, all buried in the same place. And carved into every tree surrounding the clearing was that symbol, the irregular spiral surrounded by lines resembling fingers or roots. Some carvings were ancient, the bark already healed over them. Others were recent, the exposed wood still fresh and clear. The sheriff ordered the bones to be buried properly, and the area marked as off-limits. No one should travel those trails. No one should venture into those depths. But he knew, as did everyone else, that the warning would be ignored. There were always people who didn't believe the stories, who thought them the superstitions of simple folk, who relied on their own strength and intelligence to survive where others had failed. And the forest would wait for them, patient and eternal. The survivor, whom records from the time indicate was a 26-year-old named Sarah Whitmore, never fully recovered. She spent the rest of her days in Seymour, refusing to venture more than a few hundred yards beyond the village limits. She woke up screaming most nights, saying she heard the drums again, that she saw figures standing among the trees outside her window, that she felt roots growing beneath her skin. She married a few years later to a local farmer, a kind man who never pressed for details about what had happened in the mountains. They had 3 children and lived a quiet, simple life, but she never truly smiled. There was something broken behind her eyes, something that no amount of normalcy could ever fix. She died in 1917 at the age of 49, from what doctors described as heart failure. But those who knew her understood the truth. Her heart had stopped because it carried a weight no human heart was made to bear. The weight of having seen beyond the veil, of having touched something ancient and evil that existed in the shadows among the trees, patiently waiting for its next meal. Her grave still exists in Seymour's small cemetery, marked by a simple stone, bearing only her name and dates. But locals avoid passing too close to it at dusk. It is said that sometimes, when the wind blows from a certain direction from the mountains, you can hear a low, rhythmic sound, like distant drums, like a heartbeat coming from within the earth. And if you are foolish enough to follow that sound, if you let it lure you onto the ancient trails winding through the Ozarks, you might discover that the forest is still hungry, that the symbols are still carved into the trees, and that the circle of the dead still waits for more company. The years following Sarah Whitmore's arrival in Seymour brought no answers, only more questions. The local newspaper, the Webster County Citizen, published a series of articles in 1895 about the disappearances in the Ozarks. The editor, a 34-year-old man named Thomas Bridger, became obsessed with the case after interviewing Sarah. Bridger traveled to Springfield, then to Jefferson City, scouring old county archives and court records. He discovered disturbing patterns. The disappearances occurred in cycles. Every 7 or 8 years, there was a peak. Groups of travelers vanished without a trace, or only fragments of their possessions were found, scattered along the trails. Between these peaks were periods of relative calm, when the forest seemed to sleep. The trails were safe, and the drums were silent. The year 1894 had been a peak year, and the records suggested the next one would be around 1902 or 1903. Bridger published warnings in his newspaper, imploring people to avoid certain trails during those years. But his words were met with skepticism in the larger cities. They called him a sensationalist, an exploiter of rural superstitions, a man who invented stories to sell newspapers. He was not inventing anything. In March of 1902, exactly 8 years after the incident with Sarah's group, another set of travelers disappeared. There were 5 this time, 3 men and 2 women from Kansas City, traveling south seeking opportunities on Arkansas's new cotton plantations. They left Marshfield, following the same path Sarah and her companions had taken. They never reached the other side of the mountains. A search expedition found their wagons abandoned in a clearing, their horses dead and decaying, still tethered to their harnesses. The supplies were intact, the guns loaded and dropped on the ground as if in panic, but there were no bodies. There was no blood and no signs of a struggle, only those symbols carved into every surrounding tree, fresh and dripping with sap. On the beaten earth of the clearing, someone had drawn a massive circle using white stones. Inside this circle were footprints, many of them circling repeatedly in the same pattern, as if people had danced or marched in formation. The footprints stopped abruptly at the circle's center, where the ground was churned up as if something had been buried there, or, more disturbingly, as if something had emerged from beneath the earth. Thomas Bridger was part of the search expedition. He took meticulous notes, sketched the symbols, and collected samples of the white stones. Back in Seymour, he locked himself in his office for days, comparing his findings with historical accounts, local folklore, and any information that could explain the madness. What he discovered terrified him. The symbols were not random. They were a form of writing or communication. While he couldn't fully translate them, he recognized patterns. Certain symbols always appeared near water, others on high ground, and others in deep valleys, as if marking territory and dividing the forest into zones with specific purposes. The white stones were made of human bones, ground to dust, and compressed into solid shapes. Something was using the remains of previous victims to create markers, turning death into architecture and horror into art. Bridger published his findings in a special issue of the Webster County Citizen in June 1902. The newspaper caused a sensation, with copies sent to St. Louis, Chicago, and even New York. For the first time, the outside world was paying attention to the events deep in the Ozark Mountains. However, this attention had unexpected consequences. Instead of deterring people, the stories attracted a new type of visitor: mystery hunters, occult scholars, and adventurers seeking to prove their mettle. They flocked to Seymour, asking for directions to the forbidden areas and hiring local guides willing to risk their lives for money. Most returned empty-handed, having gotten lost or been hindered by sudden storms. Some came back quiet and troubled, refusing to discuss what they had seen, while others never returned. In August of that year, Dr. Edmund Fulner, a 51-year-old anthropology professor from the University of Missouri, arrived in Seymour with 2 students. He had read Bridger's articles and was convinced the symbols were evidence of an unknown native culture, possibly predating the Osage tribes historically inhabiting the region. Fulner was methodical and skeptical. He did not believe in ghosts or supernatural creatures, but in facts, evidence, and rational explanations. He believed the symbols were native art, and the disappearances resulted from natural accidents, wild animals, or a disturbed hermit. Sarah Whitmore begged him not to go, gripping his hands with painful force and looking deeply into his eyes, trying to make him understand. It was not superstition, hysteria, or imagination. It was real. The forest was real, the creatures were real, and they were waiting. He politely thanked her for her concern, and went anyway. Fulner's expedition took scientific equipment, cameras, measuring instruments, and notebooks for detailed documentation. They planned to spend 2 weeks mapping areas with prevalent symbols, collecting samples, and making photographic records. They left Seymour on a clear late summer morning with a local guide who knew the basic trails. The guide returned alone 3 days later, running, stumbling, and nearly incoherent with terror. He said they had found something alive, something that should not exist. Fulner had insisted on documenting, getting closer, and collecting evidence. The students followed him, and then the trees began to move, not from wind, but literally walking, their roots breaking free from the ground and replanting themselves meters ahead, surrounding the group. Branches stretched out like arms, bark opened like mouths, and voices whispered in tongues that made ears bleed. The guide fled without looking back, hearing screams that were abruptly muffled as if suffocated by something thick and alive. Another search expedition was organized with 20 armed men, including Sheriff Hackett and Thomas Bridger. They found Fulner's camp easily. The tents were still set up, equipment scattered but intact, including cameras with undeveloped film. But Fulner and his students had vanished. Every tree around the camp was deeply carved with those cursed symbols, hundreds of them, covering every inch of bark, turning the forest into a grotesque book written in a language of nightmares. Thomas Bridger took the cameras back to Seymour and developed the film in his darkened room. What he saw made him consider burning everything and never speaking of it again. But the journalist in him prevailed. The world needed to know, even at the cost of his sanity. The first photographs showed normal scenes, the camp being set up, students smiling by the tents, Fulner posing by a marked tree-typical scientific expedition images. But then the photos grew strange. One taken at dusk showed figures in the background, tall, jagged silhouettes standing among distant trees, watching the camp. In the next photo, taken minutes later, the figures were closer, and in the next, closer still. The final developed photo showed the camp at night, captured with a long exposure. It revealed the 3 people sleeping in their tents, visible through the thin fabric illuminated by an internal flashlight. Surrounding the tents were circles upon circles of figures, dozens, maybe hundreds, all leaning forward, watching the vulnerable humans, waiting. Most disturbing was what appeared in the lower corner of the photograph. Something large, made entirely of intertwined roots and twisted branches, forming a vaguely humanoid shape on an impossible scale. At least 4 meters tall, perhaps more. Where its head should have been was a dark, deep hole, from which hundreds of thin, hair-like branches sprouted. Bridger published only 2 of the least disturbing photos in his newspaper, accompanied by an article detailing Fulner's disappearance. He kept the others in a sealed envelope with instructions to open them only if he died. Those images were not for public eyes, perhaps never. The publication caused an unexpected reaction. Not alarm, but fascination. Not fear, but morbid curiosity. The photos, even censored, proved something extraordinary existed in those mountains, and where there is extraordinary, people will risk everything to witness it. The problem worsened in 1903. Groups of curious people arrived in unprecedented numbers, overwhelming the small village of Seymour. Most were unprepared for the Ozark's brutal reality. Josiah Thorne's tavern, still operating after all those years, was filled with people asking for directions to places they couldn't find. The forest responded to the invasion. Disappearances multiplied, not just 1 or 2 groups per season, but dozens. People vanished in broad daylight on well-marked trails, sometimes meters from others, leaving only footprints that ended abruptly. In September 1903, the governor of Missouri intervened, declaring an area of approximately 100 square kilometers in the central Ozarks a no-go zone. He sent state guard soldiers to block main trails, patrol boundaries, and prevent more fools from venturing into the forest's heart. But forests do not respect human borders, and the creatures, whatever they were, did not understand or care about government decrees. Attacks began to extend beyond the depths. Isolated farms on the mountain's edge reported cattle disappearing overnight. Families heard rhythmic beats on their walls after dark. Children woke up screaming, saying someone too tall, with branches where arms should be, was outside the window. In October, a farm was found completely abandoned. The family had left in a hurry, leaving food on the table, clothes in cupboards, and tools scattered. On the walls, written in what appeared to be sap or blood, were those symbols covering every surface from floor to ceiling, transforming the interior into a gallery of horror. Sarah Whitmore, now 35 and a mother of 2 young children, began having visions. She saw the faces of her dead companions in wood grain patterns, clouds, and candlelight shadows. She heard their names called when alone, and felt with absolute certainty that the forest had not forgotten her, that it still wanted her, and was waiting for the right moment. In November, she made a desperate decision. She gathered a group of volunteers, including Thomas Bridger and Sheriff Hackett, and proposed something everyone thought was crazy. They would go into the heart of the woods, into the hollow of bones, and destroy the place. They would burn every tree, break every marked stone, and erase the symbols from existence. Perhaps it would break the power of that place, free trapped souls, or maybe it would infuriate something ancient and terrible that had existed in those mountains long before humans, and would remain long after they were gone. 12 people volunteered for the expedition, each knowing they might not return. They left letters for their families, put their affairs in order, made peace with their deities, and set out on a cold December morning as the first snow of winter began to fall, covering trails and erasing footprints, turning the forest into a silent white labyrinth. Sarah led the group, following memories from nearly a decade ago. Memories she had tried to forget, but that remained etched with painful clarity. Every tree, trail bend, and valley was horribly familiar, like returning to a nightmare from which she had never truly awakened. They brought kerosene, axes, torches, and everything needed for their mission of destruction, along with rifles and ammunition, though everyone knew weapons would likely be useless against what they faced. But they provided some comfort, an illusion of control in a situation beyond human control. On the second day, they found signs they were expected. The trails were too clear, free of snow when they should have been covered. The symbols on the trees glowed faintly even by day, pulsing with an inner light not from the sun. There were sounds, not drums yet, but whispers on the wind, uttering almost understandable words, revealing secrets no sane mind should know. At night, camping, they saw movement in the shadows beyond the firelight shapes, gliding between trees, circles forming and undoing, always watching, always keeping their distance. No one truly slept. They only closed their eyes and waited for morning, for the sun to protect them a few more hours. On the third day, they reached the valley. Sarah recognized it immediately, though it felt both familiar and utterly strange. The dead trees remained, but there were more, as if death was spreading, slowly consuming the surrounding living forest. The circle of stones in the center seemed larger than in her memory, and the bones so many more than during her first visit. The group descended into the valley in silence, each step sealing their fate. No snow fell there. The ground was dry, hard, and cracked, as if nothing had grown for centuries. The air carried that sweet decay smell Sarah remembered, now stronger, almost tangible, sticking in her throat like something viscous. Thomas Bridger distributed the kerosene, pouring it on dead trees, soaking the stone circle, creating flammable trails connecting everything. The others prepared torches, piled dry branches, and did all they could to ensure the fire would spread quickly and consume everything completely. Then the drums began, not gradually, but all at once, deafening, coming from all directions simultaneously. The ground shook beneath their feet. The stones in the circle vibrated so violently that some rolled out of place, and then the figures appeared. Not dozens this time, but hundreds, emerging from the trees around the valley, rising from the ground as if buried there all along, materializing from the thick, rotting air. All those impossible shapes, bodies of twisted vegetation and solidified nightmares, converging toward the circle. Sarah yelled for them to light the torches. Sheriff Hackett was the first, striking a match that sizzled against the box and bringing the flame to the kerosene-soaked torch. The light burst to life, bright and warm and wonderfully real. Others followed his example, creating a circle of flames that temporarily held the creatures at bay. And then they threw the torches onto the dead trees, the fuel-soaked ground, and the very stones of the circle. The fire roared to life with a ferocity that seemed to have its own will, climbing the trees in seconds and spreading through the valley like a wave of purification. The creatures retreated. They were not immune to fire. Where the flames touched their vegetative flesh, they burned, crackled, and crumbled into ash carried by the wind. Some tried to advance anyway, being completely consumed before reaching the group of humans. Others simply stood watching their own destruction with a terrible stillness, worse than any violent reaction. But then something emerged from the center of the stone circle, something that made all other creatures seem small and insignificant. It was that thing from the photograph, that huge form made of intertwined roots and branches, now fully visible in all its grotesque glory. It was at least 5 meters tall, perhaps 6, its body pulsing and constantly reconfiguring as if it could not decide on a single horrible shape. From the dark hole where its head should have been came a voice, not one heard with the ears, but one that resonated directly in the brain, vibrating in the bones, making teeth ache and blood boil. It spoke in all languages at once and in no recognizable language, yet everyone understood its meaning. It said they were fools, that fire would not destroy anything that mattered, that this place was merely a manifestation, a point of contact between worlds, and that the true nature of what existed there was beyond the reach of flames, beyond human comprehension, beyond time and space as they knew it. It said destroying that valley was like plucking a single leaf from a tree whose roots stretched across the entire continent. Sarah Whitmore, trembling but resolute, stepped forward. She shouted back that it didn't matter, that even if it was just one point of contact, it was one less, that every burned symbol, every broken stone, every destroyed tree was a small victory against the horror that had consumed so many lives. She declared they would fight, even knowing they could not win, because that was what separated humans from things like it. The giant creature tilted its impossible mass toward Sarah, and for a moment it seemed it would engulf her, absorb her, and turn her into a part of itself. But then it hesitated. Perhaps there was something in human determination that even that ancient thing did not fully understand. Perhaps there was power in facing the impossible and refusing to bow down. The fire continued to spread. The flames reached the base of the giant creature, and for the first time, it reacted with something that could be interpreted as pain. A sound emerged from it, a deep moan that made the air vibrate and lungs hurt. It began to retreat, sinking back into the soil from which it had emerged, taking with it hundreds of the smaller creatures that dissolved into the earth, like water absorbed by dry sand. The drums stopped. The silence that followed was unlike any before, not oppressive or threatening, just empty, as if something that had inhabited that place for immeasurable time had finally left, or at least retreated to depths where it could no longer easily touch the surface world. The group stood still, watching the valley burn. The flames consumed everything for hours, reducing dead trees to coal, cracking rocks in the intense heat, and turning ancient bones into white ash that danced in the air like ghostly snow. When the fire finally began to subside at dusk, there was almost nothing left, just blackened earth, steaming broken rocks, and a void that seemed cleaner than that place had been in centuries. All 12 who had descended into the valley returned. It was the first time in decades an expedition had returned, complete from those depths. They were burned, exhausted, and traumatized, but alive, and they carried with them the hope that perhaps they had given future travelers a better chance of surviving the crossing of the Ozarks. Sarah Whitmore lived another 24 years after that day. The nightmares never completely stopped, but they decreased in frequency and intensity. She still heard the drums occasionally, distant and faint, but now they sounded more like a memory than a present threat. She died peacefully in her bed, surrounded by children and grandchildren, having lived a life many considered impossible after what she had faced. Thomas Bridger never published the remaining photographs. He kept them until his death in 1928, when they were buried with him, according to his final instructions. Some secrets, he had decided, were too heavy to carry into the world. The hollow of bones never fully recovered. To this day, decades after the events of 1894, that area of the Ozark Mountains remains strangely barren. Trees grow around it, but not within the boundaries where the valley once existed. The earth refuses to produce life, as if still marked by something that cannot be completely erased. Tourists occasionally still get lost in those mountains. Some are found disoriented, but alive. Others disappear, without a trace. And on quiet autumn nights when the wind blows through the deep valleys, locals still close their windows and lock their doors because they know that some things are too old to die. They only sleep, waiting patiently for the next time the drums call unwary travelers into the green darkness among the trees. We have walked this dark journey together through one of the most disturbing cases the American mountains have ever witnessed. If this story has touched something inside you, if it made your heart race even a little, consider subscribing to our channel. There are so many other mysteries waiting in the shadows of history, so many buried secrets that deserve to be unearthed. Like this episode, if it made you question what really lurks in the ancient forests of this country. And in the comments, tell me, do you believe there are places in this world where reality bends?